Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of my Beginner Gardener series. Today we're going to be talking about your growing zone and frost-free growing days. These are important to know as vegetable gardeners. However, your frost-free days is the more important one to talk about compared to growing zones. Your growing zones is more important if you like to grow perennials, but we're going to get into both of those today. Okay, so we're going to start off with growing zones. So this is a number and a letter that is assigned to the city that you live in. So Canadian growing zones are calculated based off of a lot of different climatic data in order to create the growing zones for Canada. So that is why you will see a different zone for cities that are technically near each other, such as Hamilton or Guelph, where Guelph is slightly more north and Hamilton is close to the water. So there will be different zones based off of that. And what these zones do is they help you determine what you can grow in your area. The zones are most important for perennial plants. When you are out looking for different perennials, they will say what zone that they are hardy to. So if you are in a zone 5, you want to make sure that any plant that you buy that's a perennial is hardy to at minimum zone 5. If you get anything that is a higher number, such as 7, 8, or 9, your plant will have to either be treated as an annual or you're going to have to bring it indoors in the winter. So the growing zones get updated anywhere from every 10 to 30 years. In 2024, the US growing zones were updated, and Canada, it followed suit and updated theirs as well. This means that these zones are likely going to stay for the next 10 years minimum before they do another update again. As I mentioned in my container gardening episode, if you are planning on growing perennials in pots and you don't intend on bringing those pots into a shed or garage over the winter, this is another important piece where knowing your zone is important, because any perennials that are staying outdoors in pots need to be a minimum of 2 zones hardier than the zone that you're in, which means if you're in zone 5 and you buy a perennial and you want to keep it in pots over winter, it has to be hardy to zone 3 or colder. So it's very important to know that we do follow a different growing zone map than the US does. Canadian growing zones are different than American ones. In America, you will see USDA zones, and there is not a quick calculation to convert American zones to Canadian zones. However, if you are desperately trying to do it, you can take a US growing zone and add 1 to it to get the Canadian zone. However, this is not completely accurate. For example, Niagara Falls, New York and Niagara Falls, Ontario are both a zone 6B. So that's a USDA 6B and a Canadian growing zone 6B. So this is a perfect example of how you can't take a USDA zone and just add 1 to it for every single location. So it's important to know that when you are buying perennials at any store, to make sure that the growing zone on it is actually Canadian growing zones and not the USDA one. So a common plant that Canadians grow that is technically a perennial but we treat as annuals is dahlias. So dahlias are hardy to zone 9 and warmer, and the only place in Canada that is a zone 9 is Victoria, British Columbia. But a lot of us still grow it anyways. What we do is we grow the tuber and then we dig it up in the winter and overwinter it, or some people just grow it as an annual. So for those of you that are unaware, this is what a dahlia looks like. I have one started inside, so that way when our last frost passes, I'm able to plant it outside and it gets a head start on blooms. So to learn what your growing zone is, the Government of Canada has a website that you can look at, and you can check the map there of what your zone is based off of your city. There is a hardiness map that's color-coded for each of the areas of Canada, but they also have a list by municipality, so you can look up your province and your city name and you'll be able to get what zone you are in. Leave a comment below of what city you are watching this in and what growing zone that is, and whatever plant you are most excited to grow this year. Okay, so this is the more important of the two when it comes to being a home vegetable gardener, and that is your number of frost-free days. As the name suggests, it's the number of days that you have for growing where you are very unlikely to get frost. The importance of frost-free days is that they tell you what you're able to grow in your garden. For example, if you have 100 frost-free days, it is less likely that you can grow any type of vegetable that takes over 100 days to maturity, because you are likely to get frost before you are able to get any fruit off of that plant. So I have a couple examples here to show you of vegetable plants where it gives you the date to maturity on it. So if we're going to use an example of a place that has 100 frost-free growing days, here I have delicata squash, and this has 100 days to maturity. And so if you have 100 frost-free days, you are pushing the limits, but I would totally attempt to try and grow these. Next, I have Big Max pumpkins, and these are 120 days to maturity. So if you are growing with your 100 days, I wouldn't recommend trying this because you are 20 days short, but if you just want to experiment, then go ahead and do it. The next one I have is a cucumber called Amour, and this has 45 days to maturity, so you can easily get some cucumbers off of this plant, and you actually could plant this twice, if not more times, and continue to get harvest as long as the last time you plant these seeds is 45 days before your last frost. And the final one I have here are jalapenos, hot peppers, and they are 70 days. So same thing here, you can easily get fruit before your first frost because these should come in a month before your first frost. So an important piece of information related to days of maturity is to know that those days are counted from the moment you plant your plant outside. So if you're planting your seeds directly in the soil, that would be your day 1. But if you started your plants indoors, say 14 days before you plant them out, those 14 days don't count towards the days of maturity. So the 70 days on these jalapeno peppers means that from the day you plant your pepper plant outside to the day you're harvesting is 70 days. It isn't a hard and fast rule. For example, if you started your jalapeno peppers in November, your plant is probably already flowering inside, and so when you do plant it outside, you are going to get fruit pretty quickly. But if you've planted your seeds indoors within the 2 to 4 weeks before planting out, those days to maturity are really going to be the 70 days from the minute you plant it out until when you receive a harvest. So you do want to make sure you plan for that. And like I mentioned before, with the cucumbers of 45 days, because you have 100 days, you can plant this 45 days after your last frost date if you wanted to, and you would still have time to get another harvest because that would only be 90 days in your 100-day growing of frost-free days. Okay, so I'm going to teach you how to calculate your frost-free days. There's a couple ways to do it. So I am in Ottawa, Ontario, and so we're going to use that as our example. The first way is you can look up on the internet your city location plus frost-free days. So you can type in Ottawa frost-free days and see what comes up. And the government of Ontario actually has a website for the cities in Ontario on your frost-free days. And so it'll actually give you the calendar day of your last frost, your first frost, and how many days that you have frost-free. But if you look on this website, you'll see that it's actually by zones and not by cities. And so there are variations that do exist within these zones because they're quite a large geographic location. And so it's really just an estimate and not a hard and fast rule. So you can see on this website that Ottawa has 130 to 165 frost-free days, which means of all of these plants that I showed you, I could grow all of them. So if your province or territory doesn't provide you with a website similar to the Ontario one, what you're going to do is you're going to do an internet search and you're going to type in your city name plus last frost date, and you're going to write that down, and then you're going to take your city name plus your first frost date and you're going to write that down as well, and we're going to calculate the number of days that fall between those 2 days. So using Ottawa as an example and doing simple math here, we're going to use May 1st as our last frost date. and we'll use October 1st as our first frost date. This way we're using full months, much easier math. So based off of these dates, that means we have 5 full months of frost-free time. And so you're just going to take the number of days that fall in those months. So May, June, July, August, and September. And you're going to add all of those together based off, again, the number of days that fall in each of those calendar months. So taking those 5 months means that we have 152 frost-free days in Ottawa. If you remember off of the Ontario website, it said that we have anywhere from 130 to 165 frost-free days. So my 152 calculation does fall within the zones that they showed on the Ontario website. So this means that as long as the seed packet gives a days to maturity of 152 days or less, I should be able to grow that in Ottawa and be able to get a harvest before we hit our first frost. The one thing that is important to remember is, for example, with the pumpkins, it was 120 days. You have to think about what the weather looks like at the end of the season. So on October 1st, we're going to get our first frost, but what does the end of September's weather normally look like? Is it really cold? Is it really wet? Is it really rainy? Because if it's cold and wet every single day, a lot of heat-loving plants don't enjoy that type of temperature. And so if you really want to push the limits by growing something that has a long day to maturity and it's really close to your frost-free day total, just keep an idea of what that weather is looking like and if you'll even be able to get fruit off of that, or if the weather will have turned in such a way that it's really cold and wet and it's actually a shorter time span because of that nasty fall weather that's coming and the plant is really looking for that hot sun and clear days. So that is everything related to your growing zone and frost-free days. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe and check out my other episodes in my Beginner Gardener series. If you have any questions, you can pop them in the comments below and I'll be sure to answer them, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Bye.